Today we present to you a set of historical lies that everyone knows as facts and have no basis in truth. Gandhi was a saint. Most of us don't know that Gandhi abandoned his wife in order to live with a wealthy man. Gandhi was a homosexual, although he tried to remove all references to homosexual traditions from Indian temples in something he called sexual purification. To test his resistance to sexual temptation, he slept in bed naked with his teenage nieces. But worse than, say, his horrible racism, Gandhi was striving to liberate India from British rule, but he was completely happy with the strict caste system. When asked about the Indian view of racial problems in South Africa, he wrote, "We believe in the purity of the races as much as we do." Although Gandhi brought some good to the world and was tragically assassinated, he was just a human with some really hateful ideas. Newton's apple. When the history of Isaac Newton is taught, many teachers cite the old story that a physicist and mathematician actually came up with his theory of gravity after an apple fell from a tree he was sitting under and hit him on the head. Perhaps you believe it in part because it is an old story and Newton was really smart, but this story is only part of the truth, as the Royal Society of London in 2010 confirmed that the accident occurred in his mother's garden, and that there is no evidence to indicate that the apple fell on his head. The Americans were the good guys in World War II. World War II was famous as the last war that imposed clear lines between the good and the bad, as the Axis countries wanted to control the world while the Allies wanted to prevent them. But things were not like this along the line. The Americans were also responsible for war crimes on an equal footing with the actions committed by their Japanese and German enemies. And we are not talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For example, in 1943 American soldiers invaded the island of Sicily and killed 77 prisoners. At least a war in what is known as the Beskara Massacre, and although they were fighting for freedom, these soldiers threw the Geneva Convention out the window. And it was worse for European women, as they raped nearly 14,000 cases of rape in England, Germany and France from 1942 to 1945. Trojan Horse. The story began when Paris fled with Helen, the wife of the Spartan king, and a war broke out that continued for 10 years. The Greeks had a trick that completely changed the course of the war. The Greeks made a huge, hollow wooden horse in which men could hide. After the Greeks convinced their enemies that this temple was a gift of peace, the Trojans accepted it happily and brought the horse to their fortified city. That night, while the guard was sleeping, the heroes hidden by sneaking out of the wooden horse and then proceeding to slaughter and decisively defeat the Trojans. This story was without a doubt one of the greatest and most successful scams known to history. But if this is true, as Horace and Virgil hint at many evidence to deny in all that story from the ground up. Scholars have long investigated the historical accuracy of these details. However, the story has earned a place in the Western imagination as a warning against gift-bearing enemies. Mice are the reason for the spread of the Black Plague. 8 centuries after black rats were accused of spreading the Black Plague in Europe, scientists say they have compelling evidence that the rats were exonerated of that accusation. They also identified the real culprit, the jerboa, as studies have shown that climatic data dating back to the 14th century contradict the popular notion that the outbreak of the European plague was caused by a wave of disease-carrying fleas, which were taken from mice carrying them, Niels Christian said. The author of the study told the BBC that in order for this to happen, Europe would need a warm summer with not much rain. And when we looked at a wide range of climatic indicators at the time, we did not find a relationship between the appearance of the plague and the weather. And instead the epidemic seemed to be linked strangely to the climate in Asia. Analysis of several tree rings documenting annual weather conditions shows that Europe experienced an outbreak of the plague after Central Asia experienced a humid spring driven by a warm summer. Horrific conditions for black rats, but ideal for the Asian jerboa that they and bacteria-laden fleas made their journey to Europe via Silk Road to arrive after a few years to wreak havoc and spread the epidemic. The results also absolve the black rats in Europe from the responsibility for the death of more than 100 million people in the plague, which began in the middle of the 14th century and continued until the 19th century, as the disease appeared intermittently century after century, and did not remain continuously. How would it have happened with the